Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine something impossible. Try to imagine what it feels like to be someone else. Not just pretend you're them, but actually experience the world from inside their skull, seeing through their eyes, thinking their thoughts, feeling their feelings. You can't do it, not really. You can approximate, you can guess, you can empathize, but you can never truly know what consciousness feels like from the inside of another mind. Now, try something even harder. Try to imagine what it felt like to be a human 100,000 years ago. Not a different species, not an earlier evolutionary experiment. A human, Homo sapiens. Someone who, if you dressed them in modern clothes and put them on a subway, would blend right in. Their brain was the same size as yours, roughly the same shape. The neurons fired the same way, the synapses connected through the same biochemical processes. But what was it like inside their head? What did they think about when they woke up in a cave in what would someday be called Israel or South Africa? What worried them? What made them laugh? What did they dream about? This isn't just an academic question. This is one of the deepest mysteries in all of science, because 100,000 years ago, something extraordinary was happening inside human skulls. Our ancestors were right at the edge of becoming behaviorally modern. They had the hardware, the brain capacity, but the software was still being written. They were us, but they weren't quite us yet. And the question of what they were actually thinking, what it felt like to be conscious in that transitional moment, that question haunts every archaeologist, every paleoanthropologist, every neuroscientist who studies human origins. Think about what we're trying to do here. We're attempting to reconstruct the subjective experience of consciousness. From artifacts and bones, we're trying to reverse engineer thoughts from pieces of ochre and stone tools. We're trying to understand the interior life of people who lived so long ago that the pyramids hadn't been built yet. Agriculture hadn't been invented yet. Writing was still tens of thousands of years in the future. We're trying to reach back across 100,000 years and touch minds. And here's what makes it even more challenging. Thoughts don't fossilize. Feelings don't leave traces in the archaeological record. You can dig up a skeleton and measure its skull, examine its bones, determine its age and sex and health status. You can excavate living sites and find the tools they made, the food they ate, the places where they slept. You can analyze ancient DNA and trace genetic lineages across continents and millennia. But none of that directly tells you what anyone was thinking. None of it gives you access to the subjective experience of being conscious 100,000 years ago. So how do we even begin to answer this question? We have to be detectives, working with the barest fragments of evidence. We have to look at what they made and infer what they were capable of thinking. We have to examine their brains, not the actual organs which rotted away millennia ago, but the shape of the skulls that contained them, and from those shapes make educated guesses about neural organization and cognitive capacity. We have to study modern humans, modern hunter-gatherers, modern primates, and work backward, always aware that we might be wrong, that our assumptions might be colored by our own modern consciousness in ways we can't even recognize. But there's another approach too. We can look at ourselves. Because here's the strange and wonderful thing about human evolution. The people living 100,000 years ago, they're not aliens. They're not distant relatives separated by millions of years of evolutionary divergence. They're our direct ancestors. Every human alive today can trace their lineage back to those populations living in Africa 100,000 years ago. Their DNA is our DNA. Their brains built the foundation for our brains. And that means, in some fundamental way, understanding them is understanding ourselves. The thoughts they thought are the ancestors of the thoughts we think. The consciousness they experienced was the prototype of the consciousness reading these words right now. 100,000 years ago was a pivotal moment. Not the beginning of our species. Homo sapiens had been around for at least 100,000 years before that, possibly 200,000, but 100,000 years ago was when something crucial was happening. It was when behavioral modernity was emerging, when symbolic thinking was becoming firmly established, when the full cognitive toolkit that defines humanity was falling into place. Earlier humans were anatomically modern. They looked like us, but behaviorally they were different. 100,000 years ago sits right at that transition, that moment when modern bodies were developing modern minds. The archaeological evidence tells us this in whispers and hints. Around 100,000 years ago, we start seeing deliberate burials, not just bodies covered with dirt, but people carefully placed in the ground, sometimes in specific positions, sometimes with objects. At Kafse Cave in Israel, excavations found remains of up to 15 individuals buried intentionally, dated to around 100,000 years ago. This isn't hygiene. This isn't just getting rid of corpses. This is something else. This is people who had concepts, ideas about what death meant, about the relationship between the living and the dead, possibly about what happened after. Around the same time, we find evidence of ochre use becoming more sophisticated. Not just ochre itself, iron-rich rocks that produce red and yellow pigments. People had been using those for much longer. But around 100,000 years ago, we find ochre being processed deliberately, being mixed with other materials. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found what they call a paint workshop, a place where people 100,000 years ago were combining charcoal, crushed bone, ochre, and some unknown liquid to create pigments, then storing those pigments for later use. This is people who could hold in their minds the concept of a future use for something they were creating in the present. These artifacts, sparse as they are, give us our first real clues about ancient consciousness. Not what people looked like, not what they ate or where they lived, but what they were capable of thinking. And the picture that emerges is both familiar and strange. Familiar because we're looking at people who were, in every biological sense, human. Strange because the world they inhabited, the reality they experienced, was so fundamentally different from ours that their thoughts, even when similar in structure to ours, must have had a completely different context, a completely different meaning. Imagine waking up 100,000 years ago. You're in a cave, maybe, or a rock shelter, or a temporary camp in the open. Not winter coat cold, but the kind of cold that penetrates everything because you don't have central heating, or insulated walls, or even particularly good clothing. The first thought, the first conscious awareness, might just be an assessment. Is it safe? Are there predators nearby? Is anyone missing from the group? These aren't abstract philosophical concerns. These are survival calculations happening automatically, before you're even fully awake. You look around and recognize faces. This is important. You don't just see human-shaped forms. You see individuals. You remember them. You know their names, or whatever system you use to identify specific people. You know who's reliable and who isn't, who can be trusted to share food and who will hoard it. You have a mental model of each person in your band, predictions about how they'll behave based on past experience. This requires theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts and intentions and knowledge that might be different from yours. And the evidence suggests people 100,000 years ago had this capacity. They were social in ways that required sophisticated mental modeling of others. The sky is getting lighter. The day is beginning. Someone needs to tend the fire. Fire doesn't just exist naturally for humans to use whenever convenient. Fire has to be created, maintained, kept alive through the night, or rekindled each morning. Someone 100,000 years ago knew this. Someone had to take responsibility for it. This requires an understanding of cause and effect, of sequence, of time. You can't just want fire. You have to do specific things in specific order to create and maintain fire. And someone 100,000 years ago was thinking through those steps, performing those actions, keeping the fire going so the group could cook food and stay warm and keep predators away. Planning the day required memory of the past and projection into the future. Where did we find food yesterday? Is it likely to still be there today? What season is it? What plants should be producing fruit right now? Where are the animal herds likely to be? These aren't simple calculations. These require episodic memory, the ability to remember specific events from your past and use them to predict future events. They require understanding of ecological patterns, of cause and effect spread across time. And the archaeological evidence suggests people 100,000 years ago had these capabilities. They were tracking animal migrations, they were using seasonal resources, they were planning ahead, but here's the deep question. When they were doing all this thinking, this planning and remembering and predicting and modeling other people's minds, what did it feel like from the inside? Was their consciousness like ours? Was there an internal narrative, a voice in their head describing their experiences to themselves? Or was their thinking more direct, more concrete, less mediated by language? This is where we hit the limits of what archaeology can tell us. Because consciousness, subjective experience, the what, it's like ness of being someone that doesn't leave artifacts. We can infer capabilities. We can say they could plan and remember and model other minds. But whether that felt to them the way it feels to us, whether their inner experience was rich and verbal and reflective or something different, something we can't quite imagine, that we simply don't know, what we do know is that something was changing. 100,000 years ago sits right at a crucial transition in human cognitive evolution. Before this period, humans were capable, certainly. They made tools, they hunted, they survived in challenging environments. But after this period, within a few tens of thousands of years, we see an explosion of behavioral modernity. We see art, elaborate burials, long-distance trade networks, sophisticated technologies, evidence of music, evidence of abstract symbolic thinking becoming universal across human populations. 100,000 years ago was when the foundation for all of that was being laid. These were the people whose children and grandchildren and descendants over hundreds of generations would create the first cave paintings, would develop complex language systems, would figure out how to survive everywhere, from the Arctic to the tropics. And the question is, what was happening in their heads? What were they thinking that made all the rest possible? Maybe they were thinking about dinner, about where to find food, how to catch it, how to divide it among the group, about relationships and alliances and who could be trusted. Maybe they were thinking about danger, about predators and rival groups and the constant low-level threat of injury or illness in a world without modern medicine. Maybe they were thinking about the dead, about people who used to be here and now weren't, about what that meant, whether the essence of a person, whatever made them who they were, continued to exist somewhere after the body stopped functioning. Or maybe sometimes they were thinking about nothing in particular, just experiencing the moment, the feel of sunlight on skin, the taste of food, the comfort of being near other warm bodies. Maybe sometimes consciousness 100,000 years ago was just being, existing, without the constant internal chatter that seems to characterize modern minds. We don't know. We'll probably never know for certain. But what we can do, what we will do, is examine every shred of evidence available. We'll look at their brains and what neuroscience tells us about cognitive capacity. We'll look at their behaviors and what those behaviors reveal about underlying thought processes. We'll look at their art and their burials and their tools and their living sites. We'll piece together a picture of consciousness 100,000 years ago that, while necessarily incomplete, will be the best approximation we can manage based on all available evidence. If you're falling asleep to this, perfect. Let me know where you are and what time it is. Leave a comment telling me what part of the world you're in right now. Tokyo at sunrise? Chicago in the middle of the night? Somewhere I've never heard of? I love knowing that people everywhere are curious about the same questions. What were they thinking? What was it like to be human before civilization, before agriculture, before written language? These are our ancestors we're talking about. Not metaphorically, not approximately. These are the actual people whose genetic line leads directly to everyone alive today. Their thoughts, in some real sense, became our thoughts. Their consciousness evolved into our consciousness. Understanding them means understanding ourselves at the deepest possible level. Understanding where human thought comes from, how it developed, what it was like before it became what we experience today. So close your eyes and travel back. 100,000 years ago, you're in a cave in Israel or a rock shelter in South Africa. The sun is rising. The fire is burning low. Your family, your band, the people you've known your entire life are starting to wake up around you, and you're thinking, you're conscious, you're aware, you're human in every sense that matters. But what does that feel like? What are you thinking about? What's happening inside your mind in that moment before history, before civilization, before everything that would come to define the modern world? That's what we're going to explore. The minds of our ancestors 100,000 years ago. What they could do, what they couldn't do, what they might have been thinking, what we can never know. The deepest mystery of all, the mystery of consciousness across deep time. Let's start with something concrete, something physical, something we can actually measure and analyze and make scientific claims about. Let's talk about the brain itself. Not the mind, not consciousness, not thoughts or feelings or subjective experiences. Just the organ. 3 pounds of tissue sitting inside the skull. Because if we want to understand what people were thinking 100,000 years ago, we need to understand the hardware they were working with. Here's something that might surprise you. 100,000 years ago, the human brain was already the same size as the modern human brain. Not approximately the same. The same. If you could somehow measure the cranial capacity of someone living 100,000 years ago and compare it to someone living today, you'd find virtually no difference. Around 1,400 cubic centimeters, give or take. The big expansion in brain size, the one that took us from small-brained early hominins to big-brained humans, that had already happened. By 100,000 years ago, in terms of sheer volume, the hardware was in place. But here's where it gets interesting. Because size isn't everything, shape matters too. And 100,000 years ago, human brains were going through a crucial transition in shape. They were evolving from an elongated, somewhat archaic form into the globular, rounded shape that characterizes modern human brains. This wasn't happening all at once. This was a gradual process that took tens of thousands of years. And 100,000 years ago sits right in the middle of that transition. Why does shape matter? Because different brain shapes mean different internal organizations. The human brain isn't just a uniform blob of neurons. It's organized into distinct regions, each with specialized functions. The frontal lobes handle executive function, planning, decision-making. The parietal lobes process sensory information and spatial relationships. The temporal lobes deal with memory and language. The occipital lobes process vision. And the way these regions are organized relative to each other, the proportions they occupy, the connections between them, all of that affects how the brain functions. The transition to a more globular brain shape meant changes in these proportions. In particular, it meant expansion of the parietal lobes and the cerebellum. The parietal lobes are crucial for integrating information from different senses, for spatial reasoning, for complex problem solving. The cerebellum, once thought to just coordinate movement, is now understood to play important roles in cognitive processing, attention, language, and social cognition. Expansion of these areas suggests increasing cognitive sophistication, increasing ability to process complex information and perform sophisticated mental operations. Fossil evidence shows this transition clearly. Early Homo sapiens fossils, the ones from 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, have skulls that are somewhat elongated, similar in shape to earlier human species. But by 35,000 years ago, by the Upper Paleolithic, skull shapes are indistinguishable from modern humans. The transition happened gradually across that time span, and 100,000 years ago, our ancestors were somewhere in the middle. Their brains were modern in size but still transitioning in shape. They had most of the hardware for modern cognition, but the final architectural refinements were still in progress. What does this tell us about their thinking? Well, it suggests they were capable of a lot, a brain that's already the full modern size. Even if the shape isn't quite finalized, that's a brain with enormous processing power. That's a brain that can hold vast amounts of information, can perform complex calculations, can model other minds, can plan across time, can use language, can think abstractly. All the fundamental capabilities were there. But it also suggests there might have been subtle differences. The neural reorganization that came with the shift to a more globular brain shape, that likely improved certain cognitive functions. Integration of information across different brain regions probably became more efficient. Social cognition, the ability to understand and predict other people's behavior, probably became more sophisticated. Working memory, the ability to hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously and manipulate them, probably improved. Language processing, already present, probably became more fluent and flexible. These aren't dramatic differences. We're not talking about the gap between a chimpanzee brain and a human brain. We're talking about subtle refinements in an already highly capable organ. But subtle refinements can matter. They can make the difference between being able to do something awkwardly and being able to do it effortlessly. Between having to concentrate hard to maintain a mental model and doing it automatically while your attention is elsewhere. Think about what this means practically. Imagine you're 100,000 years ago and you're planning a hunt. You need to track an animal, predict where it's going, coordinate with other hunters, communicate the plan, adjust on the fly when something unexpected happens. This requires holding multiple pieces of information in your working memory simultaneously. The animal's current location, its likely destination, the terrain, the positions of other hunters, your own position, the plan, backup plans. All of this has to be active in your mind at once, constantly updated as new information comes in. A brain with fully modern organization can do this relatively easily, almost effortlessly. The information flows, gets integrated, guides behavior without overwhelming conscious attention. But a brain that's still developing that organizational efficiency might struggle more, might have to work harder to maintain the same level of performance, might occasionally drop information or fail to integrate everything smoothly. The capabilities are there, but the execution isn't quite as polished. Or, think about social interaction. You're sitting around a fire with your band. People are talking, sharing stories, making plans, arguing about who did what, forming alliances, resolving conflicts. To navigate this successfully, you need to track what everyone knows, what they believe, what they want, how they're likely to react. You need theory of mind, the ability to model other people's mental states. And you need to do this for multiple people simultaneously, updating your models in real time as new information emerges. Again, a fully modern brain does this almost automatically. You're not consciously thinking, person A believes X, but person B believes Y, and person C wants Z. You just know. You can feel the social dynamics. You navigate them intuitively. But a brain that's still refining its social cognition circuits might have to work a bit harder, might occasionally miss subtle cues, might struggle more with complex multi-party interactions. This is speculation, obviously. We can't know for certain what subtle differences in cognitive processing resulted from brains that were modern in size, but still transitioning in shape. But the fossil evidence tells us the transition was happening. The neuroscience tells us that brain organization matters, and it's reasonable to infer that people 100,000 years ago, sitting right in the middle of this transition, might have experienced their own cognition somewhat differently than we do. But let's not overstate this. The similarities vastly outweigh the differences. We're talking about the same basic neural architecture, the same fundamental processing systems, the same capacity for abstract thought, symbolic reasoning, language, planning, social cognition, memory, emotion. The hardware 100,000 years ago was, in every important sense, modern human hardware. Consider what that brain could do. It could learn an enormous vocabulary. Modern estimates suggest that even without formal education, humans can learn and retain tens of thousands of words. There's no reason to think people 100,000 years ago couldn't do the same. Their brains had the same memory capacity, the same ability to form associations between sounds and meanings, the same linguistic processing circuits. It could perform complex spatial reasoning. Tracking animals requires understanding terrain, predicting movement paths, visualizing locations you can't currently see. Making tools requires mentally manipulating three-dimensional objects, planning sequences of actions, visualizing the desired end result before you start. People 100,000 years ago were doing all of this. The archaeological evidence shows they were hunting successfully, making sophisticated tools, navigating across landscapes. Their brains could handle the spatial reasoning these tasks demanded. It could plan across time, not just immediate future, tomorrow, or next week, but distant future. Understanding seasonal patterns requires remembering what happened last year and projecting that pattern forward. Preparing for seasonal changes requires anticipating future needs and taking action in the present to meet those needs. Evidence from living sites shows people 100,000 years ago were exploiting seasonal resources, which means they were tracking time across months or even years. It could feel the full range of human emotions: fear, joy, anger, sadness, love, grief, jealousy, compassion. The neural circuits for emotion are ancient, much older than Homo sapiens. But the human brain elaborated on these circuits, integrated them more fully with higher cognitive functions. People 100,000 years ago felt things. When they succeeded in a hunt, they felt satisfaction, pride, joy. When danger threatened, they felt fear and adrenaline, and the urge to fight or flee. It could dream. This might seem trivial, but it's not. Dreaming is a cognitive function that requires specific neural machinery. The brain has to be able to generate complex narratives, vivid sensory experiences, emotional content, all while the body is paralyzed in sleep. They had REM sleep, the brain state associated with vivid dreaming. They woke up with memories of impossible experiences, of flying or being chased or meeting the dead. And they had to make sense of those experiences somehow, integrate them into their understanding of reality. It could create mental models of reality. This is perhaps the most important cognitive capability humans have: the ability to construct internal representations of the external world, not just passive sensing, not just reacting to immediate stimuli, but building coherent models of how things work, what causes what, what's likely to happen next. These models could be simple or complex, accurate or flawed, but the capacity to build them at all is what enables everything else. Planning requires models of the future. Social cognition requires models of other minds. Tool-making requires models of cause and effect. People 100,000 years ago were building these models constantly, testing them against reality, refining them based on experience. And here's something fascinating. The brain they carried, this organ that made all of this possible, it was expensive, metabolically expensive. The human brain represents about 2% of body weight, but consumes about 20% of the body's total energy budget. That's enormous. No other organ even comes close. This means that for a brain this large and complex to evolve and persist, it had to provide enormous survival advantages. Natural selection wouldn't tolerate such an expensive organ unless it was worth the cost. What made it worth the cost? Adaptability. The human brain's most important feature isn't any specific capability. It's flexibility. It's the ability to learn, to adapt, to develop new strategies for new problems. Other species are specialists, their brains optimized for particular ecological niches. Humans are generalists. Our brains are optimized for learning, for cultural transmission of knowledge, for adapting to wildly different environments through changes in behavior rather than waiting for evolution to change our bodies. 100,000 years ago, this adaptability was already in place. The brain was already capable of learning complex skills from others, of innovating new techniques, of adapting to different environments through cultural knowledge rather than biological adaptation. This is why humans were able to spread across the entire planet, not because we evolved specific adaptations for every environment, but because our brains could figure out how to survive anywhere. But that brain came with costs beyond just metabolic expense. It required an extended childhood. Human brains take years to fully mature, far longer than other primates. Human children are helpless for years, requiring constant care and protection and teaching. This creates enormous demands on parents and the broader social group. But it also creates opportunities. Those years of childhood are years of learning, years when the brain is maximally plastic, maximally capable of absorbing information and forming the neural connections that will guide behavior for the rest of life. People 100,000 years ago had long childhoods. Their children learned from adults over years and years. They absorbed the cultural knowledge of their group, the skills and techniques and understanding accumulated over generations. This is how humans avoid having to reinvent everything. Each generation doesn't start from scratch. They inherit the knowledge of their ancestors through cultural transmission. And the brain that makes this possible was already fully developed 100,000 years ago. So when we ask what people were thinking 100,000 years ago, part of the answer is simply this. They were thinking with brains that were essentially modern. The hardware was in place. The neural machinery for language, abstract thought, planning, social cognition, emotion, memory, all of it was there. The capabilities existed, but capabilities aren't the same as expressions. Having a brain that can do something doesn't mean automatically doing it. Culture matters. Experience matters. What you learn, what you're taught, what your social environment encourages or discourages, all of that shapes how your brain develops and functions. Two people with identical brains can think very differently if they grow up in different cultures, learn different things, have different experiences. So the question becomes not just what could their brains do, but what did their specific brains, shaped by their specific experiences and culture, actually do? What did they think about? What did consciousness feel like, with a brain that had all the hardware for modernity, but was embedded in a world so different from ours that almost nothing in their daily experience resembled our lives? That's what we need to explore next. Not the theoretical capabilities of the brain, but the actual lived experience of consciousness 100,000 years ago. And to understand that, we need to look at one of the most important cognitive tools humans have ever developed. Language. Did they have it? And if so, what did it let them think that wouldn't have been possible without it? Here's a problem. Language doesn't fossilize. You can dig up bones, you can find tools, you can analyze ancient DNA, but you can't excavate a conversation. You can't carbon date a sentence. You can't find words preserved in stone. So when we ask whether people 100,000 years ago had language, we're asking a question that archaeology can't directly answer. We have to work indirectly, looking for clues, making inferences, building arguments from evidence that points toward linguistic capability without proving it conclusively. And this matters enormously, because if people 100,000 years ago had language, real language, with syntax and grammar, and the ability to express complex, abstract thoughts, then their inner mental life was probably quite similar to ours. But if they didn't, if they communicated through gestures and grunts and simple vocalizations without the structure of true language, then their thinking was probably fundamentally different from ours in ways that are hard for us to even imagine. Let's start with what we know for certain. All modern human populations, no matter how isolated, have fully developed languages with complex grammar, large vocabularies, the ability to express any thought that can be thought. This universality suggests language is deeply embedded in human biology, not something invented recently by particular cultures, but something fundamental to being human. We also know that the neural machinery for language is specific and identifiable. There are regions of the brain, Broca's area in the frontal lobe and Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe, that are crucial for language production and comprehension. Damage to these areas causes specific language deficits. The human brain is built for language in ways that other primate brains are not. The question is, when did this happen? When did the human brain develop the specific neural architecture necessary for language? And more importantly for our purposes, was that architecture fully in place 100,000 years ago? The honest answer is we don't know for certain. But there's good reason to think it was. The brain structure was there. The skull shapes from 100,000 years ago show endocranial features consistent with modern language areas. The anatomical prerequisites were in place. And the genetic evidence points the same direction. Genes associated with language development, like FOXP2, show changes in the human lineage that predate 100,000 years ago by hundreds of thousands of years. The biological foundation for language was ancient by 100,000 years ago. But having the hardware doesn't necessarily mean using it to full capacity. You can have a brain capable of language without having developed language yet, so we need other evidence. We need to look at behavior, at artifacts, at anything that might indicate whether people 100,000 years ago were thinking and communicating in ways that require language. This is where symbolic behavior comes in. Because here's the thing about symbols. A symbol is something that stands for something else. A sound that represents an object. A mark that represents an idea. The relationship between symbol and referent is arbitrary, culturally determined, learned. And using symbols requires cognitive abilities that are closely linked to language. You need to be able to form abstract categories. You need to understand that this particular thing can represent that other thing. You need to share meaning with others in your social group. Language is the ultimate symbolic system. Words are symbols. Grammar is a system for combining symbols according to rules. And archaeological evidence for symbolic thinking is our best indirect evidence for language capability. So, what do we find 100,000 years ago? We find ochre, iron-rich rocks that produce red and yellow pigments. People were collecting these rocks, processing them, using them for something, and not just using them casually. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found evidence of a paint workshop dating to around 100,000 years ago. People were combining ochre with charcoal, crushed bone, and liquid to create complex pigments. They were mixing recipes. They were storing the results in abalone shells. This isn't utilitarian. This is deliberate creation of colored substances for purposes we can only guess at. Most researchers think they were using these pigments for body decoration, painting themselves. Why? Not for camouflage. Ochre isn't particularly effective for that. Not for sun protection, though that might have been a minor benefit, but for signaling, for marking identity, for indicating group membership, status, age, occasion, for creating meanings that others could read and understand. This is symbolic behavior. The color on your body stands for something beyond just being colored. It means something. And if people 100,000 years ago were using pigments symbolically, creating meanings through decoration, then they were thinking symbolically. They were operating in a mental world where things could stand for other things, where arbitrary markers could carry culturally determined significance. And that kind of thinking, most researchers believe, requires language, or at least language makes that kind of thinking vastly easier. Without language, how do you negotiate what different body paintings mean? How do you establish that this pattern signifies membership in this group, while that pattern signifies participation in that ceremony? Symbolic systems require shared understanding, and language is the most efficient way to establish and maintain shared understanding. We also find beads. Perforated shells, carefully selected, laboriously drilled, strung together to make necklaces or bracelets. The earliest secure evidence goes back 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, from sites in South Africa and Israel and Morocco. These aren't tools. These don't help you hunt or gather food. These are ornaments. They're for wearing, for displaying, for being seen, and like body painting, they're symbolic. They mean something beyond their material existence. A necklace of shells says something about the wearer. Maybe it indicates status. Maybe it marks a life stage. Maybe it identifies clan membership. We don't know the specific meanings, but we know there were meanings. People went to considerable effort to make these objects, which only makes sense if they carried significance beyond their simple existence. And again, the negotiation of significance, the shared understanding of meaning, this is the kind of thing that language makes possible and relatively easy. Then there are the burials. By 100,000 years ago, we have clear evidence of deliberate burial. Bodies placed in pits, sometimes in specific positions, sometimes with objects. At Kafsa Cave in Israel, remains dated to around 100,000 years ago show careful positioning. Bodies placed in what appears to be the fetal position. Some were buried with objects, stone tools, ochre, animal bones. This isn't just disposal of corpses. This is ritual. This is behavior laden with meaning. Burial suggests concepts about death that go beyond the simple observation that dead people don't move anymore. It suggests ideas about what death means, about the relationship between the living and the dead, possibly about continuation of identity after death. Concepts that are much easier to develop, maintain, and transmit across generations if you have language to discuss them. Try to imagine developing a burial tradition without language. You'd have to communicate through gesture and example. Someone dies, you dig a hole, you position the body, you cover it. Others watch and eventually imitate. But why? Without language to explain, how do you convey the concept that this isn't just about hygiene or getting rid of something unpleasant? How do you convey that this is about respect, about memory, about spiritual beliefs, about maintaining connection with the deceased. It's not impossible. Primates without language have mourning behaviors. They react to death. But human burial by 100,000 years ago looks like more than simple mourning. It looks like ritual, and ritual requires shared meaning, and shared meaning is vastly facilitated by language. So the circumstantial case is strong. The brain structure was there. The symbolic behaviors that language enables were there. The cultural practices that seem to require linguistic explanation were there. Most researchers now believe that people 100,000 years ago had language. Not proto-language, not some simplified precursor, but real language with syntax and grammar, and the full expressive power that characterizes human linguistic ability. But what did they use it for? What did language enable them to think and do that wouldn't have been possible without it? Because language doesn't just let you communicate, it changes how you think. It provides tools for thought itself. Consider planning. You can plan without language, certainly. Animals do it all the time. But language lets you plan more complexly, more abstractly, across longer time spans. You can talk through scenarios. You can describe what you intend to do. You can discuss alternatives. You can coordinate complex group activities by explaining roles and timing and contingencies. Language turns planning from a purely mental activity into a social activity, something that groups can do together, pooling knowledge and perspectives. Imagine planning a hunt 100,000 years ago. Without language, you'd rely on learned patterns, on imitation, on simple gestural communication of immediate intentions. But with language, you can discuss the target, you can describe where it was last seen, you can predict where it might go, you can assign roles to different hunters, you can talk through backup plans, you can learn from past hunts by describing what worked and what didn't. Language makes collaborative planning possible at a level of sophistication that would be impossible without it. Or consider social relationships. Without language, you can certainly have complex social bonds. Primates do. You can form alliances, detect cheaters, navigate hierarchies. But language adds another dimension. You can talk about people who aren't present. You can discuss reputations. You can transmit social information across the group. You can explain why someone is trustworthy or not. You can gossip. And gossip is a powerful tool for maintaining group cohesion and enforcing social norms. Some anthropologists think gossip was one of the primary drivers of language evolution. In large social groups, you need ways to track who's reliable, who's deceptive, who's generous, who's selfish. Direct observation only gets you so far. But linguistic communication about social relationships, sharing information about people's behavior and character, that lets the group function as a unit with shared knowledge about each member. Language turns social intelligence into collective intelligence. And then there's teaching. Without language, teaching happens through demonstration and imitation. The young watch the old and copy what they see. This works, but it's limited. Some skills are hard to learn purely by observation. Some knowledge is abstract, not easily demonstrated. But with language, you can explain. You can describe techniques. You can warn about mistakes. You can transmit accumulated wisdom efficiently across generations. Making complex tools requires knowledge that's hard to acquire through trial and error alone. The specific techniques, the right materials, the order of operations, the subtle tricks that make the difference between success and failure. Language lets experts explain these things to novices. It lets knowledge accumulate over generations instead of having to be rediscovered repeatedly. But perhaps most importantly, language changes the structure of thought itself. There's a hypothesis in cognitive science that language provides scaffolding for certain kinds of abstract thinking. That without language, human cognition would be fundamentally different, more concrete, more tied to immediate perception and action. That language enables recursive thinking, embedded clauses, hypothetical reasoning, counterfactuals, all the complex mental operations that characterize human thought at its most sophisticated. If this is true, then people 100,000 years ago, if they had language, were thinking in ways that are recognizably human. Their internal mental life, their stream of consciousness, probably had linguistic structure. They probably had an inner voice, a narrative running through their heads describing and commenting on their experience. They probably thought in words at least some of the time. But we need to be careful not to project too much. Even if they had language, even if the biological capacity was fully in place, their languages were different from ours. They had different vocabularies, different concepts, different ways of categorizing the world. The Inuit have multiple words for different kinds of snow because snow is central to their experience. People 100,000 years ago probably had rich vocabularies for things important to their lives and sparse vocabularies for things that didn't matter to them. They might not have had words for abstract concepts we take for granted. Numbers beyond simple counting. Precise time intervals. Complex color terminology. Abstract philosophical concepts. These develop as cultures become more complex, as needs arise for more precise communication about more specialized topics. Early language was probably more concrete, more tied to immediate experience, more focused on the practical matters of survival and social coordination. But within those limitations, language gave them enormous cognitive power. It let them think thoughts that would have been difficult or impossible without linguistic structure. It let them share those thoughts with others. It let them build shared cultural knowledge that accumulated across generations. It made them, in a very real sense, recognizably human in their cognition. So when we ask what people were thinking 100,000 years ago, we're probably asking about people who thought in language, who had inner voices narrating their experience, who could describe the world to themselves and others, who could plan in words, remember in narrative, imagine in linguistic structure. Not exactly like us. Their languages and concepts were different, but similar enough that if we could somehow listen to their thoughts, we'd recognize them as human thoughts, as the thoughts of people who were fundamentally like us, thinking about different things, but thinking in familiar ways. The language question matters because it determines whether ancient consciousness was alien to us or familiar, and the evidence suggests familiar. People 100,000 years ago probably talked. They probably thought in words. They probably had the same basic cognitive architecture that makes human thought distinctive. And that means when we try to imagine what they were thinking, we're not imagining something completely foreign. We're imagining something recognizable. Human consciousness, just embedded in a very different world. Now, let's get specific. Let's take all this abstract discussion about brains and language and cognitive capacity, and let's try to reconstruct something concrete. A day. A single day in the life of someone living 100,000 years ago. Not because we can know exactly what happened on any given day. We can't, but because thinking through the practical realities of daily life tells us something about the thoughts those realities required, about what consciousness was occupied with moment to moment. You wake up. That's the first thing. The transition from sleep to waking, from unconsciousness to consciousness. And the first moments of waking are important because they reveal automatic processes, the things your brain does before you're fully thinking. You're not in a bed in a climate-controlled room. You're on the ground, maybe in a cave or rock shelter, maybe in the open under some kind of simple windbreak. You're cold. The night was cold. 100,000 years ago included Ice Age periods, and even in Africa, temperatures at night could drop significantly. The cold wakes you. Your brain registers discomfort before you're fully conscious. You pull whatever covering you have closer. Maybe animal skins, maybe woven plant materials, maybe just huddling closer to other warm bodies. The fire has burned low during the night, just embers now, barely providing warmth. Someone needs to add fuel. Maybe that someone is you. But before you move, before you fully wake, your brain is already running checks. Automatic, unconscious at first. Movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. The absence of sounds that should be there. The breathing of people who should be nearby. Your nervous system, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, in environments where predators were a real and constant threat, is scanning for danger before you're even aware you're awake. Nothing alarming. The sounds are normal. Breathing, shifting bodies, the small noises of people sleeping. The sky is getting lighter. Not full dawn yet, but no longer full night. This is the time to wake. The safest time, when predators that hunt at night are bedding down, and those that hunt during the day haven't started yet. Your internal clock, calibrated by a lifetime of waking with the sun, tells you it's time to start the day. You sit up, your back hurts, not from anything wrong, just from sleeping on the ground night after night. Your body is young, probably. Most people 100,000 years ago didn't live past 30 or 40. But even young bodies accumulate aches from physical labor and uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. You stretch. The movement is automatic, but it feels good, loosening muscles, preparing for activity. The fire. Someone needs to tend it. In your band of 20 or 30 people, there's no formal organization, no chief dictating who does what. But there are patterns, expectations, informal roles. Young adults tend the fire. It's important work. Keeping the fire alive means not having to make fire from scratch, which is difficult and time-consuming. You gather wood from the stack collected yesterday. You feed the embers, blow gently, coax flames back to life. This is skilled work, knowing how much wood, where to place it, how much air to provide. You learned this as a child, watching, imitating, being corrected when you made mistakes. As the flames grow, light spreads. You can see more clearly now. Count bodies. Everyone's here. No one died during the night. No one wandered off or was taken. This isn't paranoia. This is reality. People do die in the night. Injuries get infected. Illnesses that seemed minor turn fatal. Sometimes people simply don't wake up. Every morning begins with this accounting. Who's here, who's not? What does that mean for the day ahead? Others are waking now. Children first. They wake easily, are immediately alert and active. Adults more slowly, groaning, stretching, moving stiffly. Everyone eventually gravitates toward the fire. Not just for warmth, though that matters. The fire is the center, the gathering point. This is where the group becomes a group, where individual people become a social unit. There's no formal morning ritual, no meeting where plans are announced. But there is communication. Looks, gestures, brief exchanges. The language you might have, the words and sentences we speculated about in the last chapter, they get used. Simple things at first. Comments about the cold, about the fire, about who slept well and who didn't. But information is being exchanged. Yesterday, someone saw tracks, large animal tracks, not too far away. That's remembered, discussed. Should we hunt today? What about gathering? The plant foods that provide most of the group's nutrition. Someone knows where certain tubers should be ready, certain fruits should be ripening. Decision-making is collective but informal. No votes, no formal consensus building. Just discussion until a general agreement emerges. Some people have more influence because of age, experience, past success. But everyone can speak. Everyone's opinion matters to some degree. This is egalitarian not as ideology but as practical necessity. The group is small enough that everyone knows everyone else. Everyone's contributions are visible. No one can dominate through force alone. The decision today is hunting. The tracks were promising, the weather is good, several skilled hunters are available. You need the right people, the right tools, the right strategy. And this is where we can really see cognition at work, where the thinking required by practical tasks reveals cognitive capabilities. Planning a hunt requires multiple cognitive operations happening simultaneously. You need mental maps, not drawn maps. Those don't exist yet, but internal spatial representations of the territory, where the tracks were seen, where the animal might be now, where it's likely to go. This requires memory, visualization, and spatial reasoning all working together. You need to hold this geographical information in your mind while also thinking about other things. You need to predict behavior. Not your own behavior, the animal's behavior. What will it do when it detects hunters? Where will it run? How can you anticipate that? Position people to intercept. This requires theory of mind extended to non-human animals, the ability to model another creature's perceptions and likely responses. It's a sophisticated cognitive operation. You need to coordinate multiple people. Different hunters need to be in different places at different times. This requires communicating the plan, making sure everyone understands their role, timing movements, so people arrive at positions simultaneously. You can describe locations, explain timing, Discuss contingencies. Without language, this kind of coordinated activity would be vastly more difficult. You need backup plans. What if the animal isn't where predicted? What if it runs in an unexpected direction? What if someone gets injured? Thinking through contingencies requires hypothetical reasoning, imagining scenarios that haven't happened yet, planning responses to multiple possible futures. This is abstract thinking, disconnected from immediate perception, possible because language and working memory let you juggle multiple imagined scenarios. The hunters prepare. Tools need to be checked. Spears. These are wooden shafts with stone points attached. Making these tools is itself a cognitively demanding task. We'll come back to that later. But using them requires skill developed over years. You need to know how to throw accurately, how to judge distance, how much force to use. This is embodied knowledge, stored not just in your brain but in your muscles, in the motor patterns learned through endless practice. The hunters leave. But they're not the only ones thinking about what needs to happen today. While hunters are gone, others have work. Gathering plant foods is primarily done by women, though not exclusively. Children help, learning by participation, and gathering requires its own sophisticated knowledge. You need to know what's edible. Not everything that grows is safe to eat. Some plants are poisonous, some are toxic unless prepared correctly, some are nutritious only at certain times of year. This knowledge has to be learned, memorized, passed down. It's ethnobotanical expertise, intimate understanding of dozens or hundreds of plant species, their seasons, their properties, their uses. This isn't instinct, this is cultural knowledge, transmitted through teaching and learning. You need to know where things are. Different plants grow in different places. Some prefer wet areas, some dry. Some grow in sun, some in shade. Mental maps again, but maps of resources, of patches of useful plants scattered across the territory. And these maps need to be updated constantly, because resources change with seasons, with weather patterns, with chance events like fires or floods. You need tools for gathering. Digging sticks for tubers, baskets for carrying, cutting implements for harvesting. Using these tools is automatic. You don't think about how to use a digging stick any more than you think about how to walk. But learning to use them, that required observation, practice, correction, and making them requires its own skills. The day progresses. Hunters are out, might be gone for hours. Gatherers are working near camp. Children play, but even play is learning. They wrestle, learning physical skills and social dynamics. They imitate adults, practicing the activities they'll need to perform. They explore, learning the environment firsthand. No formal schooling, but constant informal education through participation and observation. And while all this is happening, people are thinking. Not just about the immediate tasks, though those occupy attention, but about other things. About relationships, who's allied with whom, who's angry at whom, who's interested romantically in whom. Social cognition is constant, an ongoing background process. You're always modeling other people's thoughts and feelings and intentions, updating your understanding based on their behavior. About the past. Maybe you're thinking about yesterday's disagreement, replaying the conversation, thinking of what you should have said. Maybe you're remembering a successful hunt from last week, reliving the satisfaction of the kill. Maybe you're thinking about someone who died recently, feeling the absence, the grief that comes in waves. About the future. Maybe you're worried about the weather, noticing signs that might indicate rain or drought. Maybe you're thinking about seasonal changes coming, about moves the group will need to make to different territories. Maybe you're thinking about your own future, about partnerships you might form, children you might have, status you might achieve. Your thoughts aren't organized like a to-do list. They don't proceed linearly from topic to topic. They wander, associate, jump unpredictably. Something you see reminds you of something else, which triggers a memory, which leads to a thought about something completely different. This is the normal functioning of human consciousness, the stream of thought that characterizes mental life. And people 100,000 years ago probably experienced this the same way you do. But there are also moments of focused attention. When you're doing something difficult, something that requires concentration. The wandering mind quiets. You're fully present, absorbed in the task. Tracking an animal requires complete attention to signs, to broken twigs and disturbed earth and subtle traces. Making a complex tool requires focus on the immediate actions, the precise strikes needed to shape stone. These moments of flow, of complete absorption, they're part of consciousness too. The hunters return in late afternoon. Successful. They've killed a large animal, something substantial. This is cause for excitement, for celebration. Meat is valuable, provides concentrated nutrition and fat that plant foods don't provide in the same quantities. The animal is heavy, required multiple people to carry. It's brought to camp, and there's immediate activity. Butchering needs to happen quickly, before scavengers are attracted, before the meat starts to spoil. This is skilled work too. You need to know anatomy, where to cut, how to separate joints, how to access different parts. You need tools, sharp stone flakes for cutting, and you need to decide how to distribute the meat. This is where social dynamics become visible. Who gets which parts? In small egalitarian bands, distribution is usually generous, shares given freely. But there are expectations. Those who contributed more to the hunt receive slightly larger shares, slightly better cuts. This isn't enforced by rules but by social pressure, by reputation, by the ongoing relationships that make group life possible. As evening approaches, the fire is built up. This is social time. People gather, eating, talking, interacting. Children are everywhere, demanding attention, being indulged and corrected in turns. This is when language really serves its social function, when gossip and storytelling and joking strengthen social bonds. What do they talk about? The day's events, certainly. The successful hunt is described, maybe exaggerated slightly in the telling. Someone's good throw is praised. Someone's mistake is laughed about. But they also talk about other things. Other groups they've encountered. Places they've been. People who've died. Plans for tomorrow. Problems that need solving. And then, as darkness deepens, sleep. People lie down near the fire, huddled together for warmth. Some might stay awake longer, tending the fire, talking quietly. But eventually everyone sleeps. And in sleep, they dream. Their brains process the day's experiences, consolidate memories, generate the strange narratives of REM sleep. They might dream about the hunt, about social interactions, about things that never happened but feel real. Tomorrow they'll wake, and some will remember their dreams and wonder what they mean. This is a day. One day out of thousands, out of an entire lifetime, lived 100,000 years ago. Not every day was exactly like this. Some days were harder, some easier, some were dangerous, some routine. But this gives us a framework, a sense of what consciousness was occupied with, the practical concerns of survival, the social dynamics of group living, the emotional experiences of success and failure, connection and loss, the constant background of thought, planning, remembering, imagining. Their lives were different from ours in countless ways, but the thinking required by their lives, the cognitive operations, the conscious experiences, those were human. Recognizably, fundamentally, human. When we ask what they were thinking, we're asking about people who thought about their days the way we think about ours, who worried about similar things translated into different contexts, who felt similar emotions in response to similar situations, who experienced consciousness as a stream of thought and feeling and perception flowing through time. They were us, just living in a different world. Let's talk about something we haven't fully addressed yet, something that might be more important than intelligence, or language, or tool use, or any of the cognitive capabilities we've been discussing. Let's talk about feelings, about the emotional life of people 100,000 years ago. Because here's something that often gets overlooked when we think about ancient humans. They weren't just thinking machines, calculating survival probabilities and processing information. They were feeling beings. They had emotional lives that were rich and complex, and probably not that different from ours. Edward O. Wilson, the great biologist, once said something profound. He said the real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Paleolithic emotions. That's what we're talking about. The emotional responses, the feelings, the visceral reactions that evolved in our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago and are still with us today. Because evolution moves slowly, much more slowly than culture. Our brains evolved to deal with the challenges of life 100,000 years ago, and we're still running largely the same emotional software. So, when we ask what people were feeling 100,000 years ago, we're really asking what we would feel in similar circumstances. Because the emotions are the same. The situations were different, the contexts were different, but the feelings themselves, those are universal across human populations and across human history. Fear is fear, love is love, grief is grief. These aren't culturally constructed. These are biological responses, evolved adaptations that served crucial functions in the environments where our ancestors lived. Start with fear. This is the most obvious, the most clearly adaptive emotion. Fear kept you alive. In a world full of predators, in a world where infection could kill you and injuries had no medical treatment and countless dangers lurked in every direction, fear was your early warning system. The adrenaline surge when you heard an unexpected sound in the darkness, the racing heart when you saw movement at the edge of your vision, the gut-level certainty that something was wrong, that you needed to run or hide or fight. People 100,000 years ago felt fear constantly, or at least regularly. Not paralyzing terror every moment, but a background vigilance, an awareness that danger was always possible. You can see this in their behavior, in where they chose to live. Caves and rock shelters, places where you could put your back against something solid, where approaches were limited and you could see danger coming. Sleeping near fires, the light keeping predators away. Never going anywhere alone, safety in numbers because isolated individuals were vulnerable. But fear wasn't just about predators. It was about social dangers too. About offending others in your group, about being excluded, about losing status or allies. In small groups where you knew everyone and saw them every day, social relationships were survival. Getting expelled from the group was essentially a death sentence. You couldn't survive alone, not for long. So the fear of social rejection, the anxiety about what others thought of you, the worry about maintaining good relationships, these were just as powerful as fear of physical danger. This manifests in ways we can see archaeologically. The care taken with burials, the inclusion of grave goods, the evidence of ritual treatment of the dead. This isn't just about respecting the deceased. This is about managing relationships with the living, showing the group that you honor their dead, that you participate in group rituals, that you're a good member of the community. The anxiety about being seen as inadequate, as not contributing enough, as not caring properly, that drove behavior just as surely as fear of lions. Then there's joy, relief, satisfaction, pleasure, happiness. You feel good when you eat because eating is necessary for survival, and evolution rewards necessary behaviors with positive feelings. You feel good when you succeed in a task because success means you're effective, capable, and effective individuals survive better than ineffective ones. You feel good in the company of others because social connection is crucial to human survival, and evolution makes social connection feel rewarding. Imagine the joy of a successful hunt, not just the practical satisfaction of food obtained, though that mattered enormously, but the emotional high of the hunt itself, the excitement of the chase, the rush of the kill, the pride in your skill, the pleasure of bringing meat back to camp and being praised and admired. These feelings, this emotional reward, they reinforce hunting behavior, motivate people to do difficult and dangerous work, bind the group together through shared success. Or the quieter joys, sitting by the fire on a full stomach, warm and safe, hearing a child laugh, watching the sunset color the sky in impossible shades, the physical pleasure of intimacy, the comfort of familiar places and faces. These weren't luxuries, weren't extras added to a life otherwise filled with grim survival. These were the texture of life, the moments that made existence meaningful, that provided the positive emotional experiences that balanced the fears and anxieties and difficulties. Love, attachment, the bonds between people that made social life possible. a mother's love for her child, fierce and unconditional, driving her to protect and nurture even at cost to herself. This isn't unique to humans. All mammals show parental attachment. But human love is elaborated, extended beyond the parent-child bond. You loved your siblings, your extended family, your friends. You formed pair bonds with romantic partners, attachments that lasted years or even lifetimes. These emotional connections weren't optional. They were the foundation of human social organization. And we can see evidence of love in the archaeological record. Children who lived for years despite severe disabilities. Individuals who couldn't have survived without extensive care. Someone loved them enough to keep them alive. Adults with healed injuries that would have been incapacitating during recovery. Someone cared for them through healing. Provided food and protection when they couldn't provide for themselves. Burial practices that show grief, care taken with the dead that only makes sense if the living felt profound attachment to them. Grief. The pain of loss when someone you loved died. This emotion seems maladaptive at first glance. Why should evolution make you feel terrible when you lose someone? What survival value is there in grief? But think about it from evolution's perspective. Grief is the cost of love, the price you pay for attachment. And attachment is so valuable, so crucial to human survival, that evolution accepts grief as a necessary consequence. The capacity to grieve proves the capacity to love. And love was what held human groups together. People 100,000 years ago felt grief when others died. We know this because they buried their dead with care, because they created rituals around death, because they treated corpses in ways that suggest ongoing emotional connection. A body isn't just disposed of, it's placed carefully, positioned meaningfully, sometimes accompanied by objects. This behavior only makes sense if the survivors are feeling something profound, if they're trying to manage intense emotions through ritual action. And grief wasn't brief. In modern hunter-gatherer societies, we see extended mourning periods, ongoing mentions of the deceased, continued emotional processing of loss over months or years. There's no reason to think people 100,000 years ago were different. When someone died, especially someone central to the group, the emotional impact rippled through the entire band. Social dynamics shifted, relationships had to be renegotiated, and through all of it, people were feeling the absence, the hole left by someone who was there and now wasn't. Anger. This is a trickier emotion because we tend to see it as negative, but anger evolved for good reasons. It motivates you to confront threats, to defend yourself and others, to enforce boundaries and social norms. Without anger, you'd be exploited constantly, taken advantage of by others who would push boundaries until you pushed back. In small face-to-face societies, anger had to be managed carefully. You couldn't just explode at people you'd see every day for the rest of your life. But you also couldn't suppress it entirely, couldn't let violations go unaddressed. So there were probably informal mechanisms for managing conflict, ways to express anger that resolved disputes without fracturing the group. Mediation by respected elders, symbolic gestures of reconciliation, timeouts where angry people avoided each other until tempers cooled. We can't see anger directly in the archaeological record, but we can see its consequences. Skeletal evidence of violence, healed fractures from interpersonal aggression, but also evidence that violence was relatively controlled, that most people weren't dying from it. The anger was there, the conflicts were real, but mechanisms existed to keep them from becoming lethal most of the time. Jealousy, envy, resentment. The emotions that arise when you perceive inequity, when someone else has something you want. These feel negative, and they often lead to negative behaviors. But they also serve functions. Jealousy in romantic relationships evolved to protect pair bonds from infidelity. Envy of others' success motivates you to improve your own performance. Resentment of unfair treatment pushes back against exploitation. In egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, these emotions were probably managed through sharing norms. If someone had something good, they were expected to share it. If someone was succeeding disproportionately, they were expected to be modest, to downplay their success, to avoid appearing boastful. This isn't altruism. This is social pressure, managing the negative emotions that inequality creates. By keeping material inequality minimal and enforcing norms of humility, groups minimize the jealousy and envy that could fracture social cohesion. Shame, guilt, the self-directed emotions that arise when you violate social norms, when you do something wrong or fail to do something right. These emotions are crucial for social learning. They're how you internalize group standards, how you learn to regulate your own behavior without constant external enforcement. You feel bad when you transgress, and that bad feeling motivates you to avoid transgressing in the future. People 100,000 years ago definitely felt shame and guilt. These emotions are universal across human cultures, emerging early in development, clearly rooted in our evolved psychology. And in small groups where reputation mattered enormously, where everyone knew what you did, shame and guilt would have been powerful motivators. You couldn't hide failures or violations. Everyone saw everything. So, internal self-regulation through shame and guilt was essential for functioning in the group. Compassion, empathy, the ability to feel what others feel, to be moved by their suffering, to want to help. This might seem like a luxury, a nice-to-have emotion that evolved once life became easier, but actually compassion is ancient, probably present in our ancestors long before 100,000 years ago. Because humans survive through cooperation, and cooperation requires caring about others. We have archaeological evidence of compassion from 100,000 years ago and earlier. Individuals with severe injuries or disabilities who survived for years. This only happens if others cared for them, fed them, protected them, did the work of keeping them alive when they couldn't do it themselves. This is compassion in action, empathy motivating pro-social behavior even when it costs you. And it wasn't just for family. Evidence suggests care extended to non-relatives, to individuals who might not have direct genetic relationship. This is uniquely human, this extension of compassion beyond kin, and it's what made complex societies possible. You couldn't build larger groups if you only cared about your immediate relatives. You needed to care about group members more generally, to feel empathy for suffering and be motivated to reduce it. What's striking about all these emotions is how familiar they are, how recognizable. If you could somehow speak with someone from 100,000 years ago, if you could bridge the cultural and linguistic gaps, you'd find someone whose emotional life was fundamentally comprehensible. They'd describe feelings you recognize instantly: fear of danger and social exclusion, joy in success and connection, love for family and friends, grief when loved ones died, anger at violations and unfairness, shame at personal failures, compassion for others' suffering. The context would be different. They feared lions where you fear job loss. They felt grief when someone died from infection, where you feel it when someone dies from cancer. They were angry about meat distribution, where you're angry about salary differences. The external triggers change, but the emotions themselves, those are universal. This is what Wilson meant by Paleolithic emotions. The emotional architecture of the human mind evolved in the Paleolithic, evolved to deal with the challenges our ancestors faced 100,000 years ago. And we still have that architecture. We still feel those same emotions, triggered by different circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged. When you feel fear, you're feeling what your ancestors felt. When you feel love, you're feeling what they felt. The emotional continuity across 100,000 years is nearly complete, and this tells us something profound about consciousness 100,000 years ago. It wasn't alien. It wasn't fundamentally different from ours, because emotions are central to consciousness, to the subjective experience of being alive. And if the emotions were the same, then in this crucial dimension, consciousness was the same. They experienced life with the same palette of feelings we experience it with. The thoughts might have been about different things, but the feelings those thoughts evoked, those were human feelings. Our feelings, the same feelings that define what it's like to be conscious, to be alive, to be human. Now we need to talk about something harder to pin down, something that doesn't leave clear archaeological evidence, but which might have been occupying a significant portion of ancient consciousness. We need to talk about what people 100,000 years ago believed about the non-physical world, about death and what came after, about spirits and forces they couldn't see but might have believed were there. about the origins of religious or spiritual thinking in the human mind. This is speculative territory. We're trying to reconstruct beliefs from behavior, trying to infer what people thought about reality from the ways they treated bodies and created rituals. We could be wrong about all of this, but the evidence suggests something was happening in human minds 100,000 years ago that looks like the beginning of spiritual consciousness, of thinking about existence beyond the purely material and immediate. Start with the clearest evidence, the burials. By 100,000 years ago, people were deliberately burying their dead. Not everywhere, not every body, but consistently enough that we can identify it as a pattern. Bodies placed in pits, sometimes positioned carefully, sometimes accompanied by objects. This isn't random. This isn't just getting rid of corpses, though that might have been part of the motivation. This is ritual. This is behavior that suggests beliefs beyond the observable. Think about what burial implies. At the most basic level, it suggests an understanding that dead people are different from living people in a way that requires special treatment. Not just different because they don't move, but different in some metaphysically significant way. The person who was there isn't there anymore, but the body remains. What happened to the person? Where did they go? Without some concept of continued existence after death, burial doesn't make much sense. If death is simply cessation, if the person is just gone completely with nothing remaining but decomposing tissue, why take the time and effort to dig a pit and carefully place the body and cover it? Why not just leave it somewhere away from camp? Many animals that die get scavenged, recycled back into the ecosystem. That's efficient. From a purely material perspective, but humans, 100,000 years ago, weren't being purely material in their thinking. They were doing something else. They were treating the dead with care that suggests ongoing relationship, continued significance, beliefs about what death meant beyond biological cessation. The body might be dead, but the person, whatever made them who they were, might continue somehow, and that continuation required appropriate treatment of the physical remains. This is the seed of religious thinking. The idea that there's more to reality than what you can directly observe. That persons have some essence that transcends the physical body. That death isn't an ending, but a transition. Whether they thought about this explicitly, whether they could articulate beliefs about souls or spirits or afterlife, we don't know. But the behavior suggests the cognitive framework was developing. And it's not just burial, it's what was buried with the dead. Objects, stone tools, animal bones, ochre, shells. The dead can't use them. Not in any physical sense. So either the objects had symbolic significance, markers of identity or status that continued to matter even after death, or there was some belief that the dead might need or use these things in whatever came after. Modern hunter-gatherers show us possibilities. Many have beliefs about continued existence after death, ancestors who remain present in some way, who can affect the living, who need to be honored and remembered and propitiated, spirits that inhabit the landscape, invisible beings that cause events and require respect. These beliefs are nearly universal in traditional societies, which suggests they might be very ancient, possibly dating back to 100,000 years ago or earlier. Why would such beliefs emerge? One answer is cognitive byproducts. The human mind is built to detect agents, to assume that events have causes, that movements indicate intentional beings. This is adaptive in a world where predators hide and other humans might be threats. Better to see agency where there is none than to miss real agents and get killed. But this hair-trigger agency detection means you see intentional beings everywhere. Wind moves the grass. You think something's there. Thunder crashes. You think someone caused it. A person dies. You think they went somewhere. These cognitive quirks could generate spiritual beliefs without those beliefs being accurate descriptions of reality. Your brain tells you there are unseen agents, spirits, forces, because that's how your agency detection system works. And once the idea of invisible agents is established, it can be elaborated. The spirits have intentions, preferences, rules. They can be pleased or angered. They affect events. They need to be dealt with. But there's another possibility. Maybe spiritual experiences are real in some sense. access to dimensions of reality we don't fully understand scientifically. Maybe people 100,000 years ago were perceiving something genuine when they sensed presences, felt connections with the dead, experienced what they interpreted as spiritual encounters. This isn't provable scientifically, but we shouldn't dismiss it just because it doesn't fit materialist assumptions. Consciousness itself is mysterious enough that we can't rule out forms of awareness or perception that transcend normal sensory channels. What we can say is that by 100,000 years ago, people were thinking about death in ways that suggest something beyond pure materialism. And this required cognitive sophistication. You need to be able to think abstractly, to conceive of entities you can't see. You need language to discuss these ideas with others, to develop shared beliefs, to create rituals that embody those beliefs. The rituals themselves are important. Ritual behavior is action that's performed not for practical results, but for symbolic reasons. Burial ritual, the careful positioning of bodies, the inclusion of grave goods, the possible ceremonies that accompanied burial. These are all ritual actions. They're done because they mean something, because they connect to beliefs about death and what comes after, because they maintain relationships between the living and the dead. Ritual requires planning, coordination, shared understanding. Everyone in the group needs to know what's supposed to happen, what behaviors are appropriate, what the actions symbolize. This is cultural knowledge, transmitted through teaching and participation. Young people learn burial rituals by observing and eventually participating. They learn that this is how we treat the dead. This is what death means. This is how we honor and remember those who've left us. And ritual creates emotional meaning. Going through prescribed actions when someone dies helps process grief. It gives structure to loss. It connects you to the group, everyone participating together, sharing the burden of loss. It acknowledges that something significant has happened, that this person mattered, that their absence is recognized and mourned. But burial isn't the only evidence of possible spiritual thinking. There's the ochre, the pigments being processed and used. Many researchers think body painting had spiritual or ritual significance. Marking yourself with color for ceremonies, for transitions, for communicating with the spiritual realm however that was conceived. The color itself might have had meaning, red like blood, like life, like something vitally significant. There's the possible use of caves for purposes beyond simple shelter. Some caves show evidence of repeated visits but minimal habitation. People went there, did something, left. Were these sacred spaces? Places where the veil between ordinary and spiritual was thin? Modern hunter-gatherers often have sacred sites, places associated with spirits or ancestors or important myths. Maybe people 100,000 years ago were beginning to develop similar concepts. There's the treatment of certain objects with what looks like reverence. Crystals, unusual stones, fossils, objects that were different from the ordinary. These were sometimes collected, sometimes placed in significant locations, sometimes buried with the dead. Did they have spiritual significance? Were they thought to have power, to embody spirits, to serve as connections to the non-physical? We're speculating now, building on hints and suggestions. But what seems clear is that by 100,000 years ago, human consciousness was beginning to contemplate dimensions of existence beyond the immediately observable. People were asking the big questions. What happens when we die? Is there more to reality than what we can see and touch? Are there forces or beings beyond the physical? Do actions have significance beyond their immediate practical results? These are philosophical and spiritual questions, and asking them required cognitive capabilities that were newly emerging or newly refined 100,000 years ago. Abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, ability to conceive of entities and realms beyond direct experience. Social structures that could maintain and transmit beliefs across generations. And the questions mattered. They weren't academic exercises. They were attempts to make sense of profound experiences. Death, the loss of people you loved, the mystery of where they went. Dreams, where you encountered the impossible and it felt completely real. Unexplained events, things that happened for no obvious reason, suggesting hidden causes. Consciousness itself, the strange fact that you were aware, that there was something it felt like to be you, that inside your skull was an entire mental world. These experiences demanded explanation. And 100,000 years ago, people were beginning to develop explanations that invoked the spiritual, the non-physical, the transcendent, not necessarily in the elaborate forms that later religions would develop, not with codified beliefs and sacred texts and organized hierarchies, but in simpler, more intuitive forms. A sense that reality had layers, that the visible world wasn't all there was, that persons were more than just bodies, that death was transition rather than ending. Were they right? Did their spiritual intuitions correspond to actual features of reality? Or were they confabulating, creating comforting fictions to manage the anxiety of mortality and the mystery of consciousness? Different people today answer these questions differently, and we can't resolve them by examining archaeological evidence from 100,000 years ago. What we can say is that spiritual consciousness was emerging. The capacity to think about the transcendent, to imagine realities beyond the physical, to develop beliefs and rituals that address these dimensions of experience. This was a crucial development in human cognition. It meant humans could find meaning in existence beyond simple survival, could create frameworks that made suffering and loss and death somewhat more bearable, could build solidarity through shared beliefs and collective rituals. And it meant their consciousness was occupied with questions that still occupy us. What is the nature of reality? What happens after death? Is there purpose to existence? Are we alone in the universe, or are there other forms of awareness? These aren't modern questions. These are human questions, arising naturally from the structure of human consciousness, asked by people 100,000 years ago and asked by us today. When we imagine what people were thinking 100,000 years ago, we need to include this dimension. They weren't just thinking about practical survival, about food and shelter and social relationships. They were also thinking about meaning, about significance, about the spiritual dimensions of existence. They were beginning the long human conversation with the transcendent, the attempt to understand what we are and why we're here and what it all means. Their answers were probably different from the answers any particular religion gives today. But the questions were the same, and the capacity to ask those questions, to seek answers beyond the material, to create meaning through spiritual belief that was emerging 100,000 years ago. That was part of what they were thinking about, part of what made them human. Let's talk about time. Not time as physicists understand it, as a dimension of space-time, but time as conscious beings experience it. The sense that there's a past that you remember, a present that you're experiencing, and a future that you can imagine. But it requires sophisticated cognitive machinery that was fully operational 100,000 years ago. Think about what memory actually is. It's not like a recording device, playing back exact copies of past experiences. Memory is reconstructive, creative. Every time you remember something, you're rebuilding that memory from fragments, filling in gaps, interpreting the past through the lens of the present. And there are different types of memory, each serving different functions, each requiring different neural systems. Start with episodic memory. This is memory of specific events, particular moments in your life. The memory of what happened yesterday, last week, 10 years ago. These aren't just abstract knowledge. These are experiences you can mentally revisit, moments you can place yourself back into, reliving from your own perspective. When you remember your 10th birthday or your first day of school or that time you got lost, you're using episodic memory. People 100,000 years ago had episodic memory. We know this because their behavior required it. Successful hunting meant remembering where animals had been seen before, what they'd done, where they'd gone. This isn't abstract knowledge about animal behavior. This is memory of specific events. I saw tracks here 2 days ago. The animal went this direction. It was moving toward that valley. That's episodic memory guiding behavior. Gathering required the same capability. I found ripe fruit at that tree last season, at this time of year, so probably there will be fruit there again now. That's episodic memory, combined with pattern recognition, using specific remembered experiences to predict future events. The richness of the memory matters. Not just that there were fruit, but where exactly, what the tree looked like, what landmarks helped you navigate there, what time of day you arrived, whether others were with you. Social life depended even more heavily on episodic memory. You remembered specific interactions with other people, what they said, what they did, whether they kept promises or broke them. Your understanding of each person in your group was built from accumulated memories of specific encounters. That time he shared food when you were hungry. That time she helped with a difficult task. That time they failed to show up when needed. All these memories formed your model of who people were, whether they could be trusted, how they'd likely behave. And episodic memory created personal history. Your sense of yourself as someone who had lived through specific experiences, who had a past that shaped who you were now. The memory of learning to hunt from your father, the memory of your first successful kill, the memory of the day your mother died. These weren't just facts about your life, these were formative experiences that you carried with you, that defined your identity, that you could revisit mentally and draw meaning from. But episodic memory raises a question. What's it like to remember being yourself at different points in your past? Modern humans have a strong sense of personal continuity. You remember being younger and recognize that person as you, even though you've changed dramatically. The child you were at 5 is connected to the adult you are now by an unbroken chain of memories and experiences. You are the same person despite decades of change. Did people 100,000 years ago have this same sense of personal continuity? The neural machinery was there, the episodic memory system that makes it possible, but the sense of self might have been somewhat different. In societies without written records, without photographs, without external memory aids, your personal past existed only in your own mind and in the memories of others who knew you. There was no objective record to anchor identity across time. This might have made personal identity more fluid, more embedded in the present. You were who you were now, based on your current relationships and roles and capabilities. The past mattered, certainly, but maybe not with the same rigid continuity that writing and record-keeping would later create. Maybe identity was more about ongoing relationships and current performance than about biographical narrative. Or maybe not. Maybe the sense of personal continuity is so fundamental to human consciousness that it emerged automatically once the neural capacity existed. Maybe people 100,000 years ago had the same strong sense of being themselves across time that we do. But we know they had the memory systems that make personal continuity possible. Then there's semantic memory. This is memory for facts and concepts, knowledge about the world that isn't tied to specific experiences. You know that fire is hot, that water flows downhill, that certain plants are poisonous. You don't remember learning each of these facts as specific episodes. They're just part of your general knowledge about reality. People 100,000 years ago had extensive semantic memory. They knew hundreds of plant species and their properties. They knew animal behavior patterns, migration routes, seasonal changes. They knew how to make tools, what materials worked best, what techniques produced desired results. They knew social rules, kinship relationships, territory boundaries. All of this was cultural knowledge, accumulated over generations, stored in memory, transmitted through teaching. And semantic memory interacted with episodic memory. General knowledge informed interpretation of specific experiences. Specific experiences modified general knowledge. If you knew that a certain animal was dangerous, and then you had a specific encounter with that animal, your general knowledge shaped how you experienced and remembered the encounter. And the encounter might modify your general knowledge, make it more nuanced or accurate. Working memory is different again. This isn't memory of the past. This is the ability to hold information in mind actively, to manipulate it, to use it for ongoing tasks. When you're following directions, you hold the sequence in working memory. When you're doing mental arithmetic, you hold the numbers in working memory. When you're having a conversation, you hold what's been said in working memory, so you can respond appropriately. Working memory capacity varies between individuals, but all humans have it to some degree, and 100,000 years ago, it was crucial for survival. Planning a hunt required holding multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously. The location of the target, the positions of other hunters, the terrain, the backup plans. Making complex tools required holding the sequence of steps in working memory, knowing what comes next while executing the current step. Some researchers think advances in working memory capacity were crucial for the emergence of behavioral modernity. that the transition from archaic to modern human behavior reflected improvements in working memory that allowed more complex planning, more sophisticated tool-making, more elaborate social coordination. By 100,000 years ago, these improvements were in place, or nearly so. People could juggle multiple thoughts, hold complex plans in mind, coordinate intricate activities, and working memory enabled mental time travel into the future, not just remembering the past, but imagining the future, projecting yourself forward, visualizing scenarios that haven't happened yet, planning actions based on predicted outcomes. This is uniquely human, or at least humans do it far more elaborately than any other species, and it requires working memory to hold the imagined future in mind while comparing it to the present and planning the steps needed to get from here to there. People 100,000 years ago were definitely thinking about the future. Evidence of seasonal planning shows they anticipated future needs and prepared for them, storing food, collecting materials for tools they'd need later, moving to different locations ahead of seasonal changes. This all requires future-oriented cognition, the ability to mentally project forward and take present action based on future predictions. But how far forward could they project? Modern humans think about distant futures, years or decades ahead. We plan careers, save for retirement, make decisions based on impacts we won't experience for years. Did people 100,000 years ago have the same temporal reach, or was their future thinking more limited, focused on the next few days or weeks or seasons? Probably somewhere in between. They could certainly think seasonally, planning for changes they knew would come in months. They probably thought about life stages, understanding that children would grow, that they themselves would age, that roles and capabilities would change over years. But the distant future, thinking about impacts decades away that might have been less developed. Without the cultural frameworks that create long-term future thinking, the cognitive capacity might not have been fully utilized. Memory and future projection create personal identity. You are the person who has had these past experiences and who will have future experiences. Your identity is extended across time, connected by memory backward and anticipation forward. This temporal self, this sense of being a continuous entity existing across past, present, and future, is fundamental to human consciousness. And it creates the possibility of regret and hope. Regret because you can remember past actions and wish you'd chosen differently. Hope because you can imagine future states and believe you can work toward them. These emotions require temporal consciousness, the ability to mentally inhabit different points in time and compare them. People 100,000 years ago felt regret. They remembered mistakes, social violations, missed opportunities. They couldn't change the past, but they could learn from it, could modify future behavior based on past errors. They imagined better futures, anticipated success, planned actions intended to improve their situations. These are human emotions, arising from the temporal structure of consciousness. But there's another dimension to memory that matters: collective memory. In societies without writing, collective memory existed only in minds, maintained through storytelling and repeated narration. Important events were remembered because people talked about them, because stories were told around fires, because children learned their group's history through oral tradition. This created a shared past that defined group identity. We are the people who did this, who came from here, who survived that challenge. Collective memory explained why things were the way they were, why certain places were significant, why certain practices were followed. It provided context for individual lives, situating personal experience within larger narratives. And it meant that memory was social, not just individual. What you remembered was shaped by what the group remembered, by the stories that were told and retold. Events that didn't fit the narrative might be forgotten or reinterpreted. Events that mattered to group identity would be preserved and elaborated. Memory was negotiated collectively, maintained through social processes. This probably limited historical accuracy. Without written records, without objective external documentation, memories could drift over time. Stories could be embellished, details could change, events from different times could merge. The collective past wasn't a precise record but a living narrative, constantly being reconstructed to serve present needs. But that didn't make it less valuable. Collective memory served crucial functions. It maintained cultural knowledge, transmitting understanding of the environment, of social rules, of technical skills. It created group cohesion, binding people through shared history. It provided meaning, explaining where the group came from and why their ways of life mattered. People 100,000 years ago were embedded in these collective memories. They knew their group stories, had been taught the important narratives, understood themselves as part of something larger than individual existence. This social dimension of memory shaped consciousness, meant that thinking about the past wasn't just personal but communal. So when we ask what people were thinking 100,000 years ago, part of the answer involves memory and time. They were remembering the past, personal experiences, and cultural histories. They were experiencing the present, processing sensory information and immediate situations. They were imagining the future, planning actions, and anticipating outcomes. And they were doing all of this within a social context. Their memories and anticipations shaped by and connected to the memories and anticipations of their group. The temporal structure of consciousness, the ability to be situated in time, to remember and project and experience duration. This was fully operational 100,000 years ago. People lived in time the way we live in time, with memory connecting them to the past and imagination connecting them to the future, and the present flowing continuously between them. This temporal consciousness, this is another dimension in which ancient minds were fundamentally like ours. Here's something that might be the most important thing about human consciousness. We are profoundly, unavoidably social. Your mind isn't just a thinking machine operating in isolation. Your mind is built for other minds, designed to interact with them, to understand them, to navigate the complex social worlds that humans create wherever they live. And 100,000 years ago, this social dimension of consciousness was already fully developed. Think about what it means to understand another person. Not just observe their behavior, but understand what they're thinking and feeling and wanting. You look at someone's face and you see emotions there: happiness, sadness, anger, fear. You're not just seeing muscle movements and facial configurations, you're reading mental states. You're perceiving what's happening inside another person's mind based on external cues. This is theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others. To understand that other people have thoughts and feelings and beliefs and desires that are different from yours, that they know things you don't know, that they want things you might not want, that they experience the world from their own perspective, not from yours. This seems obvious, but it's actually a sophisticated cognitive capability. Many animals don't have it, or have it only in limited forms. Young human children develop theory of mind gradually. Typically, by age 4 or 5, they can pass tests showing they understand that others can have false beliefs, can know things that aren't true. This is a crucial developmental milestone. Before you understand that others have different mental contents than you do, you can't really navigate social situations effectively. You can't deceive, can't cooperate strategically, can't truly empathize. People 100,000 years ago definitely had theory of mind. The archaeological evidence might not show this directly, but everything about human social organization requires it. You can't coordinate group hunts without understanding what others know and intend. You can't teach effectively without understanding what learners do and don't comprehend. Theory of mind is prerequisite for the kinds of social complexity humans routinely achieve. But it's not just understanding that others have minds. It's the constant, automatic, often unconscious process of modeling those minds. Throughout your waking hours, you're running mental simulations of other people, predicting what they'll do, inferring what they're thinking, adjusting your behavior based on your models of their mental states. This social cognition is so fundamental that you barely notice you're doing it, but it's consuming massive amounts of cognitive resources. Imagine sitting around a fire with your band 100,000 years ago. 20 or 30 people, all of whom you know intimately. You've lived with them your entire life. You know their personalities, their quirks, their histories. And as you sit there, your mind is processing social information constantly. Who's sitting next to whom? That's meaningful. Who's making eye contact with whom? That matters. Who's speaking? Who's listening? Who's being ignored? All of this carries social significance. And you're not just passively observing, you're actively modeling. He's angry about something, probably about what happened earlier. She's trying to smooth things over. She doesn't want conflict. Those two are forming an alliance. I can see it in how they're interacting. He's excluded, sitting apart, and he's unhappy about it. Every person is a model you're maintaining and updating in real time. This is computationally expensive. You're tracking not just what people are doing, but what they know, what they believe, what they want, how they feel, what they're likely to do next. And you're doing this for multiple people simultaneously. And then you're using these models to guide your own behavior. How can I improve my standing with this person? What alliance structures are forming, and where do I fit? Modern hunter-gatherer societies give us clues about how this social cognition functioned. In small face-to-face groups, everyone knows everyone's business. Privacy is minimal. Reputation matters enormously because you can't escape it. What you do becomes known by everyone, and people remember. Your entire social identity is constructed through ongoing interactions that everyone can observe. This creates intense selection pressure for social intelligence. You need to read situations accurately, to understand group dynamics, to navigate conflicts without alienating people you'll live with for the rest of your life. The socially intelligent thrive. They form strong alliances, avoid costly conflicts, gain access to resources and mating opportunities. They make enemies, violate norms, find themselves excluded from cooperation. 100,000 years ago, this pressure was intense. Your band was your entire social world. There were occasional encounters with other bands, opportunities to form relationships across groups, but day-to-day life was these same 20 or 30 people. You couldn't leave if things went badly. You couldn't start over somewhere else. You had to make it work with these people or face isolation, which was essentially a death sentence. So social thinking was constant and crucial, and it required sophisticated capabilities. You needed empathy, the ability to feel what others feel, to simulate their emotional states in your own mind. When someone you cared about was suffering, you felt their pain, not metaphorically, but literally. Your neural systems for processing emotion activated in response to their emotion. This empathy motivated prosocial behavior, helping and comforting and supporting others. You needed to track reputations. Who's generous? Who's selfish? Who can be trusted to keep promises? Who breaks them? Who's competent at various tasks? Who isn't? This information was stored in memory and updated constantly based on observed behavior. Social information flowed through the group, creating collective knowledge about each member's character. You needed to understand social norms. Every group has rules, explicit and implicit. How food is shared, how conflicts are resolved, what behaviors are acceptable and which aren't. These norms aren't written down. They're learned through observation and participation and correction when you violate them. Violation leads to criticism, to reduced reputation, possibly to exclusion if violations are severe enough. Understanding norms requires understanding that there are rules beyond personal preference. That certain behaviors are wrong, not just because you don't like them, but because the group doesn't allow them. This is a sophisticated moral understanding, recognizing that some actions violate shared standards that everyone is expected to follow. And you needed political intelligence, the ability to form alliances, to negotiate relationships, to manage the coalition structures that determine who has influence and who doesn't. In egalitarian societies, there aren't formal leaders with coercive power, but there are still status hierarchies, still people whose opinions carry more weight, still dynamics of influence and coalition. Navigating this required understanding who's allied with whom, whose support would help your position, whose opposition would hurt it. It required knowing when to assert yourself and when to defer, when to give and when to take. How to accumulate social capital without appearing arrogant. How to maintain good relationships while also advocating for your own interests. This is complex thinking, multi-level modeling of social structures, and people 100,000 years ago were doing it constantly, not as conscious strategic calculation, usually. Much of it was intuitive, automatic, the result of social intelligence that operated below conscious awareness. But it was happening, shaping behavior, guiding interactions, determining outcomes. Language made all of this vastly more effective. You could talk about people who weren't present, discussing their actions and character. You could coordinate with allies, planning collective action. You could teach children about social expectations, explaining rules, rather than waiting for them to be discovered through violations. You could negotiate conflicts, talking through disagreements rather than just reacting emotionally. But language also created new forms of social complexity. Now, you could lie. You could say things that weren't true, creating false beliefs in others' minds. This meant others had to evaluate your trustworthiness, to compare what you said to what you did, to watch for inconsistencies. The arms race between deception and detection accelerated with language. You could manipulate reputations through gossip, saying things about others that might or might not be true but which would shape how others viewed them. You had to worry not just about what you did, but about what was said about you. And you could use strategic gossip yourself, influencing others' reputations for your own purposes. The social mind 100,000 years ago was occupied with these dynamics constantly. When you woke up, you were thinking about your relationships. During the day, you were navigating social situations. In the evening around the fire, you were participating in social bonding, storytelling, gossip, teaching, all the activities that maintained group cohesion. Even in sleep, you probably dreamed about social interactions, your brain processing social information unconsciously. And this social thinking shaped individual identity. You understood yourself partly through others' perceptions of you. Your reputation, your role in the group, your relationships, these weren't just external facts, they were part of your self-concept. Who you were was partly determined by who others thought you were, by how you fit into the social structure. This creates an interesting question. Was the sense of self 100,000 years ago more collective than ours? Modern individualism, the idea that you're a separate, autonomous entity whose identity transcends social relationships, this is relatively recent culturally. In traditional societies, identity tends to be more relational, more embedded in kinship and group membership. Maybe 100,000 years ago, people thought of themselves primarily in relational terms, not as isolated individuals but as nodes in social networks. Or maybe the distinction isn't that stark. Maybe humans have always had both, a sense of individual existence, the feeling that there's a self that perceives and feels and thinks, and simultaneously a sense of social embeddedness, the understanding that this self exists within relationships and is partly defined by them, both aspects coexisting, creating a self that's both individual and social. What we know is that the social dimension of consciousness was rich and complex 100,000 years ago. People were thinking about other people constantly. They were modeling minds, predicting behavior, managing relationships, navigating group dynamics. This wasn't peripheral to consciousness. This was central. For social animals like humans, understanding and interacting with other minds is one of the primary functions of consciousness itself. And this tells us something important about what people were thinking. A huge portion of their mental life was social, thinking about relationships, about what others thought of them, about group dynamics, about alliances and conflicts and reputations, not as occasional concerns but as constant ongoing processes that shaped almost every aspect of experience. When we imagine consciousness 100,000 years ago, we need to imagine intensely social consciousness. Minds that were always oriented toward other minds, that processed social information continuously, that found meaning and identity primarily through relationships with others. This is human consciousness in its most fundamental form. Not isolated calculation but social connection, minds reaching out to other minds, creating together the complex social reality that has characterized human life for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, let's talk about something that makes humans unique. Not just conscious, not just social, but creative. The ability to imagine things that don't exist and then bring them into existence. To solve problems in novel ways. To innovate, to invent, to create new possibilities where only old realities existed before. 100,000 years ago, this capacity was flowering in ways that would fundamentally transform human existence. Start with something concrete. A stone tool. Not just any stone, a carefully shaped piece of flint with a sharp edge that can cut, scrape, pierce. Making this tool required multiple cognitive operations that happened in sequence, guided by an end goal that existed only in the maker's imagination before the work began. First, you needed to visualize the desired end product. Before you struck the first blow, you had to imagine what you wanted to create. The shape, the size, the edge angle, all of this existed as a mental model. This is mental imagery, the ability to create visual representations internally without external stimuli. You're literally seeing something in your mind's eye that doesn't exist yet. Second, you needed to understand the properties of materials. Not all rocks can be knapped into tools. Flint works, obsidian works, certain other stones work, but granite doesn't, limestone doesn't. You need rocks that fracture in predictable ways, that produce sharp edges when struck correctly. This knowledge is learned, accumulated through experience and teaching. It's understanding of cause and effect, of material properties, of how the physical world behaves. Third, you needed a plan, a sequence of actions that would transform raw material into finished tool. Strike here first with this much force at this angle, then strike there, then refine this edge. Each action depends on previous actions succeeding. The plan exists in working memory, guiding behavior step by step while remaining flexible enough to adjust if something goes wrong. Fourth, you needed motor skills, the physical ability to strike accurately with precise force. This comes from practice, from embodied learning. Your muscles know how to perform these actions even when conscious attention is elsewhere. But learning those motor patterns initially required conscious attention, feedback, correction, refinement over hundreds of repetitions. And finally, you needed the ability to evaluate the result. Is this good enough? Does it meet the specifications you imagined at the beginning? If not, what additional work is needed? This evaluation requires comparing the physical reality in front of you to the mental model you started with, identifying discrepancies, deciding whether they matter. All of this for a simple hand axe. Imagine the cognitive complexity required for more sophisticated technologies. Composite tools where multiple materials are combined. Hafting a stone point onto a wooden shaft requires both components, plus binding material, plus understanding of how forces will transfer through the assembly. You're creating something that's more than the sum of its parts, where the combination enables new functions that neither component could perform alone. Or consider the ochre processing workshop at Blombos Cave. People weren't just collecting ochre. They were combining multiple ingredients: charcoal, crushed bone, iron-rich rock, some kind of liquid, probably seal fat or blood or plant extract, mixing them to create pigments with specific properties. This is chemistry, experimental chemistry, trying different combinations, observing results, refining recipes. Who figured this out? Someone experimented. Someone tried mixing things, saw that certain combinations produced interesting results, remembered what worked, repeated successful procedures. This is innovation through trial and error, guided by imagination. Someone imagined colored substances, suitable for body painting or other uses. Then they worked toward that goal, testing approaches, learning from failures, eventually succeeding. This process requires multiple cognitive capabilities working together. Imagination to conceive of goals not yet achieved. Planning to work toward those goals systematically. Memory to track what's been tried and what worked. Attention to focus on tasks requiring precision. And, crucially, patience to persist through failures, to keep trying when approaches don't work, to refine and adjust until success is achieved. And it requires cultural transmission. Once someone figured out how to make good ochre pigments, that knowledge needed to spread. Other people needed to learn the technique. This meant teaching, demonstration, verbal explanation, apprenticeship. It became collective knowledge, part of the cultural toolkit available to everyone in the group. This is cumulative culture, the human ability to build on previous innovations, to pass knowledge across generations, to create cultural evolution that's far faster than biological evolution. Animals can learn from each other, can develop local traditions. But human cultural accumulation is unique in its scale and complexity. We inherit not just genes, but entire knowledge systems, technologies, practices, ideas developed over thousands of generations. 100,000 years ago, cumulative culture was already operating. Evidence shows technologies spreading geographically, similar tool types appearing in different locations, suggesting either invention followed by transmission or independent invention of similar solutions. Either way, people were innovating, and the innovations were being preserved culturally. But innovation wasn't just technological, it was also social. Someone had to invent burial practices. Before the first deliberate burial, humans presumably left bodies where they died or disposed of them pragmatically. Dug a pit, placed a body carefully, covered it, maybe included objects, possibly performed rituals. This was social innovation, creating new practices that addressed needs or expressed meanings in novel ways. Who was that person? What were they thinking when they innovated burial? Were they responding to grief, trying to manage intense emotions through new behaviors? Were they expressing spiritual beliefs, ideas about death that required different treatment of bodies? Were they solving a practical problem, like scavengers disturbing bodies left in the open? We don't know, but someone thought of it first. Someone created a new practice that spread because others found it meaningful or useful. The same with body decoration. Someone first thought to collect ochre and apply it to skin. Why? Maybe practical concerns initially. Ochre has some insect-repelling properties, but it became decorative, symbolic, meaningful. The innovation started solving one problem and evolved to address others. This is common in innovation, solutions finding new applications, technologies being repurposed for unanticipated uses, and someone innovated beads. Took shells, laboriously drilled holes through them, strung them together. This required tools for drilling, patience for the tedious work, and most importantly, imagination that the end result would be worth the effort. The first person to make beads couldn't have seen others wearing them, couldn't have known social reactions, couldn't have been certain the innovation would be adopted. They were creating something truly novel based on internal vision of possibilities. This kind of creativity, the ability to imagine and create the genuinely new, requires cognitive flexibility. You need to think beyond current reality, to envision alternatives, to ask what-if questions. What if we treated bodies this way instead of that way? What if we marked ourselves with colors? What if we wore decorations? These questions lead to experiments, to innovations, to cultural change. And 100,000 years ago, this creative capacity was active. People were innovating technologically, socially, symbolically, not at the pace we see later, not with the explosion of creativity that characterizes the Upper Paleolithic 30 or 40,000 years ago. The cognitive machinery for innovation, for creativity, for imagining and creating the new, it was operational. What were people thinking when they innovated? Probably very much what innovators think today. Frustration with current limitations, desire for better solutions, curiosity about possibilities, satisfaction when experiments succeed, disappointment when they fail, and probably some anxiety about social reactions. Will others accept this innovation? Will they think it's strange? Will they adopt it or reject it? Because innovations are inherently risky socially. They deviate from established norms. They ask others to change behaviors, to try new things, to trust that the innovation is beneficial. In conservative societies, which most traditional societies tend to be, innovation can be viewed suspiciously. Innovators face social pressure to conform, to stick with proven approaches rather than experimenting with unproven alternatives. But humans are also curious, attracted to novelty, interested in new possibilities. The same minds that resist change are also fascinated by innovation when it succeeds. This tension creates a dynamic where some innovations are adopted, spreading through populations and across generations, while others are tried and abandoned. Failing to gain traction, 100,000 years ago, this dynamic was playing out. Some innovations succeeded, we know, because we find their traces archaeologically. Body decoration, bead-making, ochre processing, burial practices, these spread and persisted. Other innovations probably failed, were tried and abandoned, leaving no trace. We'll never know what creative attempts were made and rejected, what possibilities were explored and found wanting, but we know creativity was happening. People were thinking beyond the given, imagining alternatives, experimenting with new approaches. This creative thinking, this innovation, it's distinctively human. The thoughts that accompanied creativity were probably complex. Concentration when performing difficult technical work, frustration when approaches failed, insight when solutions suddenly became clear, pride when innovations succeeded, anxiety about teaching others, hoping they'd learn correctly, satisfaction when innovations were adopted, when creative work became collective knowledge, and underlying all of it was imagination, the ability to think about things that don't exist yet, to hold in mind possibilities, alternatives, potential solutions, to mentally manipulate concepts and objects, to simulate actions and predict outcomes before committing to physical attempts. This imaginative capacity is what made innovation possible, and it was fully functional 100,000 years ago. Some researchers think the period around 100,000 years ago represents the final refinements of the cognitive capacities that would enable the full flourishing of human creativity. The brain size was already there. The language capacity was there. But the integration of these capabilities, the smooth coordination that enables complex, innovative thinking, that was still being fine-tuned. By 50,000 years ago or so, that integration was complete, and human creativity exploded, producing cave art and elaborate rituals and sophisticated technologies, and all the markers of behavioral modernity. 100,000 years ago was the foundation for that explosion. The creative capacity existed, but was still being exercised, still being developed culturally, still working out its full potential. People were innovating, but not yet at the pace that would come later. They were creative, but their creativity was still ramping up, still finding its full expression. When we think about what they were thinking, we need to include this creative dimension. They weren't just passively experiencing reality or automatically following traditions. They were imagining alternatives, experimenting with new approaches, creating innovations that would shape human culture for millennia to come. They were thinking creatively, using imagination to transcend the given and create the new. And in doing so, they were exercising the capacity that would eventually give humans dominance over every terrestrial environment and the ability to reshape the planet itself. So here we are at the end. We've explored the brains they carried, the language they might have spoken, the emotions they felt, the memories they formed, the social worlds they navigated, the innovations they created. We've reconstructed, as best we can from fragmentary evidence, what it might have been like to be conscious 100,000 years ago. And now we need to ask the final question. What was the gap between their minds and ours? What could they do that we can do? And more importantly, what can we do that they couldn't? Let's start with what was the same. The hardware was essentially identical. The brain size, the basic neural architecture, the sensory systems, the motor control, all of it was modern. If you could transport an infant from 100,000 years ago to today, raise them in a modern environment, they'd be indistinguishable from any other human. They'd learn language normally, perform academically at normal levels, function socially without obvious deficits. The biological capacity for modern consciousness was completely in place. The emotional life was the same. Fear, joy, love, grief, anger, compassion, shame, all the basic emotions that characterize human experience. They felt these things the way we feel them, triggered by different circumstances but fundamentally identical in quality. When they succeeded, the satisfaction was as real. The emotional palette hadn't changed. The social intelligence was the same. Theory of mind, empathy, reputation tracking, political maneuvering, all the complex social cognition that humans specialize in. They understood other minds, navigated group dynamics, formed alliances, managed relationships. The social dimensions of consciousness were fully developed. The creative capacity was there. Imagination, innovation, problem solving. The ability to conceive of alternatives and work toward goals. They were making tools, developing techniques, creating new practices. The cognitive machinery for creativity was operational, even if cultural evolution hadn't yet produced the full flowering of human creativity we see later. Memory systems were modern. Episodic memory, semantic memory, working memory, all functioning at modern capacity. They remembered their pasts, imagined their futures, held complex information in mind while performing tasks. The temporal structure of consciousness was complete. So, what was different? What separates us from them? Because clearly something separates us. We've accomplished things they couldn't have imagined. We've built civilizations, developed technologies, created knowledge systems that span the globe and reach beyond Earth. Not the hardware. The biological capacity is the same. The difference is entirely cultural. The accumulated knowledge and practices and technologies developed over 100,000 years of cultural evolution. They had the same potential we have. They just didn't have the cultural foundations we inherited. Think about writing. This seems fundamental to modern consciousness, to how we think and organize information. But writing was invented only about 5,000 years ago. For 95,000 years after 100,000 years ago, humans had the cognitive capacity for writing, but hadn't invented it yet. Once invented, writing changed everything. It externalized memory, allowed knowledge to accumulate beyond what individuals could remember, enabled long-distance communication across time and space. But the cognitive capacity that makes writing possible, that was there 100,000 years ago, symbolic thinking, language, pattern recognition, fine motor control for making marks, everything needed for writing existed. The innovation just hadn't happened yet. And once it did, it wasn't that human brains got better. It was that humans gained access to a tool that leveraged existing capacities in new ways. Or think about mathematics. Modern humans can do calculus, understand abstract algebra, work with concepts that are far removed from concrete experience. People 100,000 years ago probably couldn't. But not because their brains were incapable. Because mathematical concepts are cultural inventions, built on foundations that took thousands of years to develop. Number systems, arithmetic operations, geometric principles, all of these had to be invented, refined, taught, built upon by successive generations. The capacity for mathematical thinking was there 100,000 years ago. The neural machinery for handling abstract symbols, logical operations, quantitative relationships, all present. But without the cultural framework of mathematics, without the concepts and notation and pedagogical methods developed over millennia, that capacity couldn't be fully expressed. This is the pattern across all domains. The biological potential was there. The cultural realization came later, sometimes much later. Science as systematic investigation of nature, philosophy as rigorous examination of fundamental questions, art as deliberate aesthetic creation, technology as systematic application of knowledge to practical problems. All of these are cultural achievements built on biological capacities that were present 100,000 years ago. So, what were people thinking 100,000 years ago? They were thinking with modern minds embedded in ancient culture. They had all the cognitive tools we have, but none of the accumulated knowledge. They could have understood quantum mechanics if someone had taught them, but no one could because that knowledge didn't exist yet. They could have appreciated Shakespeare if they'd had the language and cultural context, but neither existed. This creates an interesting thought experiment. If you could somehow communicate with someone from 100,000 years ago, bridge the cultural and linguistic gaps, what would you find? You'd find someone fundamentally like you. Someone who could learn new concepts, grasp abstract ideas, engage with sophisticated arguments. Someone whose consciousness, whose subjective experience, was recognizably human. But you'd also find differences. Deeper in domains that mattered for survival, intimate understanding of local ecology, animal behavior, plant properties, narrower in scope, limited to their immediate environment, without the global and systematic understanding that science provides. They'd know things you don't know. You'd know things they couldn't even imagine. Their social understanding would be profound but limited in scope. They'd understand group dynamics with sophistication born of lifelong intimate contact with the same people. But they'd have no concept of societies larger than a few hundred people, no understanding of institutions or bureaucracies, or the complex social organization that characterizes modern life. Their sense of time would be different, less precise, more seasonal, and cyclical than our linear chronology. They wouldn't think in hours and minutes, wouldn't conceive of history as a sequence of dated events, wouldn't project futures decades or centuries ahead. Their temporal consciousness would be more rooted in the present, extended into past and future, but not with the reach we achieve through cultural technologies like calendars and written history. Their relationship with technology would be more direct. They made their own tools, understood intimately how they worked, could repair or recreate them if needed. Modern humans use technologies we don't understand, depend on systems we can't repair, live in a technological environment that's largely opaque to us. They'd find this strange, possibly unsettling. But in fundamental ways, consciousness would be the same. The structure of experience, the flow of thought and feeling, the awareness of being aware. If you could be inside their heads, experiencing what they experienced, it would feel familiar. Not identical, the contents would be different, but the form would be recognizably human. The what? It's like ness of being conscious. That's universal across human populations and human history. This is perhaps the deepest answer to our original question. What were they thinking? Thoughts that arose from human cognitive architecture, shaped by human concerns, expressed in human patterns. The specific thoughts were different, about different things, framed by different cultural knowledge. But the thinking itself, the process of consciousness, that was the same. They worried about things we don't worry about. Predators, starvation, injury without medical care, social exclusion from their only community. We worry about things they couldn't have conceived. Climate change, nuclear war, artificial intelligence, existential risks to technological civilization. But the experience of worry, the feeling of anxiety about uncertain futures, that's identical. They loved people the way we love people. The attachment to family, the bonds with friends, the intensity of romantic love. The contexts were different. Smaller groups, lifelong familiarity, no possibility of starting over somewhere else. But the emotions were the same, the capacity for deep connection that makes us human. They tried to understand their world the way we try to understand ours, seeking patterns, asking why, creating explanations. Their explanations were different, more likely to invoke spirits or forces than natural laws, but the impulse to understand, to make sense of experience, to find meaning in events, that's universal. They created meaning through the same channels we do, through social connection, through skilled work, through creative expression, through spiritual belief, through contributing to something larger than themselves. The specific meanings were different, embedded in their particular cultural context. But the need for meaning, the drive to find significance in existence, that's fundamental to human consciousness. So the gap between us and them is narrower than you might think. It's a gap in cultural accumulation, in the knowledge and technologies and institutions built up over 100,000 years of history. They had the same potential we have. They just hadn't had time to realize it yet. If we could bring them forward, give them our knowledge and cultural tools, they'd function fine in modern society. If we went back, stripped of our cultural inheritance, we'd struggle to survive in their world. The adaptation would be difficult, both directions. But it would be possible because the consciousness is compatible. We're the same species, the same minds, just living in vastly different cultural realities. This tells us something important about human nature. We tend to see ourselves as fundamentally different from our ancestors, more advanced, more evolved, superior. But biologically, cognitively, we're not. We're the same humans who lived 100,000 years ago, just with more accumulated culture. The capacity for everything we've achieved, for science and art and technology and philosophy and all the rest, that existed 100,000 years ago. It just hadn't been expressed yet, and this should make us humble, because it means that the people we might consider primitive, living in simple societies with basic technologies, they're not less capable than us. They're just working with less cultural inheritance. Give them the same opportunities, the same education, the same cultural tools, and they perform at the same level we do. Human cognitive capacity is universal. Cultural expression is variable. It should also make us hopeful, because it means that the cognitive capacity to solve our current problems, to face the challenges of the 21st century and beyond, that capacity is the same capacity that got humans through challenges 100,000 years ago. We're not different. We're not less capable. We have the same brains, the same consciousness, the same potential. We just need to use it wisely. When we ask what they were thinking 100,000 years ago, we're really asking what it means to be human. What consciousness feels like, what concerns occupy minds, what capabilities we have, what limits we face. And the answer is that they were thinking like humans think, feeling like humans feel, experiencing consciousness like humans experience it. They were us, just earlier in the story, just beginning the journey that brought us to where we are now. Understanding them helps us understand ourselves, see where we came from, what we've always been, what hasn't changed despite 10,000 generations and the rise of civilization. The emotions are ancient, the social intelligence is ancient, the creative capacity is ancient, the consciousness that experiences all of it is ancient. We're running very old software, programming that evolved to solve challenges from 100,000 years ago. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that ancient consciousness, those Paleolithic emotions and patterns of thought, maybe they're not deficits to overcome but features to understand and work with. Maybe the solution to modern problems isn't transcending our evolutionary heritage but understanding it, accepting it, finding ways to create cultures and technologies and institutions that work with human nature rather than against it. 100,000 years ago, people were thinking about survival, connection, meaning. We're thinking about the same things, just in different contexts with different tools. The fundamental concerns haven't changed. The fundamental consciousness hasn't changed. We're them, just with more history, more culture, more accumulated knowledge. And they were us, just at the beginning, just starting to express the full potential of human consciousness. Their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, they were human experiences. Our ancestors, in the deepest sense. Not just biologically, but conscious, aware, thinking, feeling, human in every way that matters. So rest now. Let these thoughts settle. Imagine those minds 100,000 years ago, thinking thoughts that echo through time to reach us now. The same consciousness, the same awareness, the same what-it's-like-ness of being alive and aware. They were us. We are them. The gap is an illusion. Consciousness connects across time, makes us all part of the same story, the story of minds trying to understand themselves and their place in the universe. Sleep well, wherever you are, whenever you're reading this, and know that the consciousness experiencing these words, that's the same consciousness that experienced the world 100,000 years ago, ancient and modern, unchanging and evolving, fundamentally human across all of time.